When I was a child, one of the stories that my aunt often told me inspired me with real horror. She always pronounced it with a special intonation, as if she saw in front of her those terrible events that happened to her many years ago. The story was so real that, although my aunt never mentioned ghosts or mysticism, every time I listened to it, goosebumps ran down my skin. It was one of those stories that will be remembered for a long time. Today, I will share it with you. Only now, years later, do I realize how much scarier everything was than it seemed in childhood. Aunt Catherine was an independent woman. At the age of 30, she had already gone through a divorce, moved several times, and changed several cities. She worked as a college teacher in a small town in the north. The place was quiet, surrounded by fields and forests, and nothing foreshadowed trouble. Catherine always said that she chose this town specifically to be away from the noise of the big world, in which she felt like a stranger. Everything was going well until one day she started noticing strange things. It started right after she moved into a house on the outskirts of town. The house was old but cozy. Large windows, wooden floors, a fireplace, everything you can dream of if you want privacy. At first, everything was fine. She went about her business, worked, and sometimes walked in the neighborhood. But soon the first warning signs appeared, which she did not take seriously at the time. One night, returning late from lectures, she noticed that the door to the house was ajar. She did not immediately pay attention, blaming it on her inattention. Maybe she didn't close it properly when she left, but nothing was touched inside. No belongings, no documents. Everything was in its place. It was only the next day that she remembered about it and felt a slight chill down her spine. A couple of days later, Catherine heard strange noises in the house at night. It was like a rustle, as if someone was moving cautiously on the floor. The sounds came from the hallway leading to the bedroom. She listened, trying to figure out what it might be, but the noises stopped. She had to leave the light on that night, though she didn't admit it to anyone. She blamed everything on the old house. The wooden floors could creak, the wind could make the windows shake. But something inside her told her that it wasn't that simple. The real horrors began a few weeks later. One night, Catherine woke up to feel like someone was standing by her bed. It was a strange feeling, like the presence of someone uninvited, which is impossible to explain. She didn't see anything specific, but she was sure she wasn't alone. Waking up in a cold sweat, she listened. The house was quiet. Only her breathing broke the silence of the night. The next day, as if trying to find a rational explanation, she looked around the house. Whether the windows are closed, whether the door is not touched, everything was in its place. But when she went into the pantry, she found one strange detail. The box with her old books was open. This confused her because she was sure she had never opened it since moving in. Who could have touched her? After the incident with the open box, Catherine began to feel uncomfortable in her own home. She tried to calm herself down, to convince herself that it was just an accident or her forgetfulness. But with each passing day, the feeling grew that the house no longer belonged to her, as if someone or something was watching her every move. A few days later, when she came home after work, she was greeted by a strange smell in the hallway. It was an acrid, unpleasant smell, reminiscent of rot. Catherine immediately decided that maybe something was rotten in the refrigerator or in the trash. But when she checked all the sources where the smell could come from, it turned out that they were clean. The smell seemed to come from somewhere on the walls or floor, but its source was elusive. This worried her even more because the house was relatively new to her, and he shouldn't have such problems. The next night, the situation worsened. Catherine woke up in the middle of the night to a loud banging coming from the attic. The sound was muffled and repetitive, as if someone was deliberately banging something heavy. Her heart pounded in her chest, but gathering her courage, she got out of bed and went to the attic. She only had a phone in her hands, the light from which did not help much to disperse the darkness. She slowly climbed the creaking stairs, trying to convince herself that this was just an old house that was living its own life. But when she got to the attic door, the knocking suddenly stopped. It made her freeze. She stood at the door for a long time, trying not to breathe too loudly to catch any sound. But everything was quiet. Catherine gathered all her courage and slowly turned the knob. The door to the attic opened with a terrible creak. It was dark and cold inside, as if there was no heating at all. Catherine shone her phone around, and a dusty, neglected room appeared in front of her, littered with old things and boxes. But everything seemed to be in its place. Nothing was disturbed. She went inside and looked around. There was no indication that anyone could have been in the attic. It was only when she was about to leave that her gaze caught on something strange. In one corner of the attic, under an old carpet, it seemed that something had been buried. The floor was slightly raised, as if something had been put there, but they did not take care to hide the traces. It looked suspicious, and although an inner voice told her not to touch anything, Catherine couldn't help herself. She threw the carpet aside and saw the floorboards, which had obviously been recently replaced or redone. They were different in color from the others. Something was hidden under the floor. The next day, Catherine called her friend the master to inspect the floor and help her figure out what was under the boards. When he opened the floor, there was a small box under the boards, dusty and old, but it didn't seem to have been there for too long. There was a bag inside, tightly tied. My aunt did not dare to open it right away. She was afraid to touch what could be traces of someone's secret life. When she did open the package, she found an old notebook, photographs, and several letters inside. These were the notes of some man who once lived in this house. In his letters, he talked about the strange things that were happening in the house, sounds, strange movements of objects, and a sense of presence that followed him everywhere. Catherine realized with horror that this man was facing the same phenomena that were now haunting her. The letters also mentioned disappearances. The man wrote that his wife and child disappeared under strange circumstances, and that after that the house began to live its own life. He searched everywhere for them, contacted the police, but no trace was found. However, the man himself was sure that they never left the house, as if something kept them there. These recordings caused Catherine real horror. She realized that her story was probably not just a coincidence, but a continuation of something terrible and inexplicable that had happened to previous residents. Her mind was racing between a rational explanation and the horror that she was caught up in something she didn't understand. The next night, Catherine woke up to the sound again. But this time, it wasn't a knock. It was a movement. It was as if someone was walking slowly down the corridor. She could hear the floorboards creaking, as if someone was carefully approaching her bedroom. My heart was pounding, and my hands were sweating with fear. She couldn't figure out what to do. Stay in bed or try to escape. But suddenly the sound stopped when the footsteps stopped right in front of her door. It was unbearable. My aunt gathered her courage and abruptly turned on the light. The room lit up, but no one moved outside the door. She went to the door and slowly turned the handle, preparing for the worst. But when she opened it, the hallway was empty. Not a single trace. After that night, Catherine decided not to stay in the house alone. She moved in with a friend for a few days until she figured out what to do next. But even at a distance from home, she couldn't get rid of the strange sensations. She was haunted by the feeling that something or someone did not want to let her go. It seemed to her that she was being watched even in another place, as if what had happened in the house had followed her. After a few days at her friend's, Catherine still couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching her. She could not find an explanation for these feelings, but every night, lying in bed, it seemed to her that the shadows outside the window were moving, that someone was standing on the street and looking at the house. It haunted her, and even her friend began to notice her tense state. One evening, when they were having dinner, Catherine, nervously glancing out the window, suddenly froze. It seemed to her that in the distance, in the thick twilight, a figure flashed by. She immediately disappeared. Catherine decided to return to the house, despite all her fears. She worried that if she left home for a long time, this sense of control over her life would disappear completely. She couldn't afford to stay in fear anymore. When she returned, the house greeted her with its usual silence. But now that silence seemed ominous. Catherine noticed that the smell of rot had become stronger, and she seriously thought about calling specialists to check the foundation. Perhaps it was something like mold or a dead rat trapped in the walls. But somewhere deep inside, she knew that the reason was different. Her nights began to be filled with strange sounds again. Creaks, footsteps, and incomprehensible rustles. But now a new feeling has been added to this. A look. Every night, when she lay in the dark, it seemed to her that someone was watching her closely through the windows. She started to close the curtains and move the furniture towards the doors, but it didn't help. The feeling of persecution did not leave her. Late one night, Catherine heard a loud sound, as if something had hit the back door of the house. She jumped out of bed, grabbed the phone, and went to the door. There was nothing. Only the cold autumn wind stirred the trees. She returned to the bedroom, but sleep did not come again. After a few minutes, it seemed to her that someone was slowly walking around the house, as if walking around its perimeter. The sound of footsteps became unbearable for her. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she was about to call the police, but suddenly, everything went quiet. She was listening in tense silence when she suddenly heard a sound. It wasn't a knock or a rustle. It was as if someone was trying to open the window in the living room. At that moment, fear consumed her completely. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen and slowly went downstairs. As she approached the living room, her breathing became even heavier. She carefully opened the door and saw a window that was ajar. Cold wind was blowing into the house. She didn't remember opening it. Her hands were shaking as she took a step towards the window, but suddenly her gaze fell on something that made her blood run cold. There were footprints on the ground by the window, footprints of someone's shoes. These were large, rough footprints that led around the house, and they were fresh. The next day, Catherine went to the police. They listened to her there, but treated her story with obvious skepticism. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses. They said that maybe it was the teenagers who decided to make fun of her. Catherine, although disappointed, knew that the police could hardly help. However, the situation has become worse. One day, when she returned home after a long day at work, she found a note on the doorstep. There was only one short question written on it. Do you want to know the truth? No name, no signature. This note seemed to be the key to everything. But what Catherine was most afraid of was finding out who had left her and what exactly that person wanted to say. Questions began to swarm in her head. Who's watching her? Why does the house she lives in cause so much horror? And what kind of truth is she being offered to reveal? Catherine didn't know how to react to this. She spent the night locked in her bedroom, trying not to make any noise. In the morning, she inspected the area around the house and saw the same boot marks again. They were more obvious. Now they led to the backyard, and it was obvious that someone had come at night. A few days later, Catherine received the note again. This time it said, "You shouldn't have come back." Now she was sure that someone in particular was watching her. Someone who knew her and was watching her every move. The anxiety grew with each passing night when the footsteps outside the window and the knocking in the attic became unbearable. One day, Catherine couldn't stand it and decided to act. She remembered the letters found under the boards. They said that the former owner of the house was sure that someone was stalking his family. He wrote about a strange man who was often seen in the neighborhood, but the police never managed to find him. Catherine began to put everything together. She realized that the man who had lived here before her was most likely the victim of the same man who was stalking her. But what happened to his family? Why did his wife and child disappear? Catherine turned to the local archives and found out that several children had indeed disappeared in the area several decades ago. But the official versions of the police did not connect these cases with the house. Among the missing children was the child of the former owner. But here's what was most frightening. One of the articles mentioned that the man's wife was an attractive woman, and she was often surrounded by one of the neighbors who was obsessed with her. Catherine realized that the stalker might have been the neighbor. He probably fell in love with the wife of the previous owner and could not accept her rejection. But why is he still here? Why does he keep watching the house and those who live here? The answer was terrible. This man could be a maniac who killed or kidnapped those who dared to approach his victim. But the scariest thing was that now this man had chosen her,